Good afternoon, everyone. This is yours truly, Michael Got Energy Stewart. It has been a moment since I've done a live Facebook feed, and so I want to first say to everyone, all my Facebook family and friends and viewers who do so anonymously, hello. And I hope that all is well for you and your household in these trying times that we find ourselves faced with. Certainly, it would be safe to say that all across the globe, people are encountering all forms of struggle. And with the new presidency and the cabinet that is now in control of the Senate and the House, we are seeing some trying times. If you are not familiar with survival instincts, it is certainly being put to the test right now. And so there was a few things that were heavy on my heart that I wanted to convey to those that would listen. Certainly, I want to put this disclaimer out. I am in no way bashing anyone's faith, anyone's system of belief, anyone's preference on worship or affiliation with any religious organization. I do want to, for sake of clarity, make it clear that I do not subscribe to any particular religious order. That does not mean that I have no belief or knowledge of the existence of the part the universe plays in all that we call creation, and what some would simply refer to as God. So for the sake of attempting to communicate in a way that others could understand what I will be sharing, you will hear me use the term God, because again, I do not seek to offend. It is certainly not my intention. So here is what is heavy on my heart in light of the present status that we find ourselves in with the government today, the shutdown of the government, the enacting of amendments to laws, and Project 2025 and its intent. I'm not a political person, but I do keep my ears to the ground as a matter of speaking, to be informed of what's going on behind the scenes. And so with the latest development that has practically everyone across the globe in an uproar, the two primary things, the shutting down of the government and their inability to come together to negotiate and come to a resolve. And secondly, the threat of many families not receiving SNAP benefits come November 1. Now, mind you, many government employees did not get paid this last pay cycle. And so that in itself has created some havoc across the globe. And now we find many are faced with the threat of not being able to receive their SNAP benefits, let alone adequately feed their families moving forward, because no one knows how long we will be in this situation. So here is what I wish to do. I want to point out for those who identify themselves as Christian believers who follow the system of tithing. Now, this again is not an attack against the system, nor is it an attack against any church, and certainly it is not an attack against any individual. It is simply my intent to bring light to some principles that for those who adhere to the Bible would become a little more understanding of why there is so much conflict today with biblical principles as it relates to tithing and the collecting of money. So I'm not going to talk specifically about any one individual. Certainly, there are others already doing that. And so I am going to make sure that I am not deliberately or intentionally attacking any notable figures or church heads or church leaders or members of any particular church body. I just simply want to share some insights as it relates to the context of the scriptures surrounding the issue or the matter of tithing. So with that being said, I want to first highlight in Genesis, the 14th chapter, that entire chapter reveals an encounter that the patriarch Abraham, according to scripture, has with Melchizedek, who happens to have been at that time, according to the text, the king of Salem and the priest of God. These were two titles that are associated with Melchizedek. And so, if you're not familiar with the storyline, Abraham's nephew, Lot, had been taken captivity by a rival king. And there were 5 other kings over smaller provinces who also came under attack by this same king, and each had lost people and possessions to this one particular. So when you get an opportunity, read the whole story so you can put it in context to understand Abraham's part that he plays in this particular text. Now, mind you, according to the scriptures, Abraham has already been blessed immensely by God. Not only in people, in the terms of the growth of his family nucleus, but also in his possessions. If you recall in the Bible text, Abraham's promise, or God's promise to Abraham, was that everywhere the soles of his feet touched, God would give him the land. And so this becomes his perpetual inheritance. And so Abraham is already wealthy, if I could use today's present terminology. He's already a very wealthy man. He is not in need of any resources. He has enough, and he is, according to today's terminology, he was indeed at that time one of the best, if not the only one, a true military strategist. So it's not like Abraham was poor or destitute or in need of help. He was already blessed according to the text. Now, so what does that have to do with this matter of tithing? Well, without giving you a whole dissertation on the history according to the text, Abraham goes to war against this one particular king, and the other 5 kings join in, and they ultimately conquer, and they succeed, and they win. And so, as it were, in the historical context, whenever a battle was won, everything associated with that rival force now became the possession of the person who is now considered the victor. And in this case, Abraham becomes the victor. And so as the Bible refers to it as the spoils of victory. And so once Abraham returns from conquering this rival king, he then enacts something that would later become the foundational blueprint of what we today refer to as the tithing system. And so what Melchizedek does, this term tithe that we hear so loosely today, Melchizedek King Abraham gives to Melchizedek, Abraham gives to Melchizedek 1/10 of the spoils of victory. Now, I want to put emphasis on what he gives to Melchizedek. He gives to Melchizedek 1/10 of the spoils of victory. These are the possessions, and to include any people that has now been recovered, that were captured by this rival king. They become Abraham's spoils of victory. And from that mass amount of possessions, to include the people, he gives to Melchizedek 1/10 of the spoils of victory. Now, here is where it becomes interesting, because after he does so, the other smaller kings, if I can use that phrasing, suggests to Abraham that he releases the people recovered back to them to return to their provinces, but he keeps all of the possessions of monetary value. Now, Abraham's response is very unique, because what he says in response to the suggestion, he says, I have already vowed to God that I would not keep so much as a shoe latchet unless you say you have blessed me. Now, many, when reading the text, skim right over that response and not really consider what Abraham, according to the text, is establishing in his words. So when he says that I've already made this vow to God, we know this is a preemptive vow before going into victory and before going into the war to gain victory. He makes this vow that I'm not going to keep nothing that is considered to be rightfully my possession as the victor. So we understand he gives Melchizedek 1/10 of those spoils. The other king suggests, give us the people, you keep everything of monetary value. Abraham says, no, sir, not going to do that because of the vow that I made. And so now what does he do? In plain, simplistic explanation, after giving Melchizedek 1/10 of the spoils, he is now left with 90% of what has been gained from this battle. So what does he do with the 90% that is left from this battle that he has gained? Well, first, let's point out that what is given to Melchizedek is not Abraham's own accumulations of wealth. Think about that. He does not give to Melchizedek 1/10 of his own accumulations of wealth. It is only what he has gained from this particular battle that we know as the spoils of victory. Now, the remaining 90% that is gained from this battle, he then begins to distribute amongst the 5 kings that accompanied him in the battle, because his vow was he would not keep for himself anything lest the people be able to say they have blessed Abraham. So this becomes the foundational blueprint of what we know today as the tithing system. So now, later in the biblical storyline, this now becomes the blueprint for the Mosaic law on giving, or the tithing requirement. So there we see now a second instance of tithing that shows up in Genesis chapter 28. And so again, I would encourage you in your leisure to not only read that chapter, but to actually dig in and research the concepts in that entire chapter. Now, in the chapter of Genesis that I just referred to, we see where Jacob, who is the grandson of Abraham, and there's a history behind what leads up to this point of Jacob now making a vow to God. Now, his vow is different from the vow that Abraham made. Jacob is on the run because he has slighted his brother Ishmael out of the birthright. And over time, Jacob's clan, his family nucleus, and his possessions has increased. And so he now wants to reconcile with his brother. However, he is fearful that his brother has not forgiven him for what he has done. And so what he does is he sends across the Jabbok River his clan as an act of peace, so that there would be no interpretation from his brother's side that he was coming to attack. And he remains. And where he remains is where he makes a vow to God. And he vows to God as a way of preparing for this passage, that if God continues to bless him and provide for him safe passage, that he would give to God a tenth of all that he possesses. Now he's talking about his personal wealth. He makes this vow that if God continues to provide for him and protect him along this passage, that he will then give to God a tenth of everything he possesses. So his is a slightly different variation from the vow that Abraham, his grandfather, makes. But he makes this vow. Now, here is what is interesting to note. One could only speculate whether or not Jacob actually carried out his vow. Now, we do know that eventually he does have safe passage, and he does link up with his brother, and they do kind of reconcile. But what we don't see nowhere in the scriptural text, and maybe I've overlooked it, I'm not 100% perfect, but we do not see, or should I say, I have not seen in the biblical text where Jacob actually carries out this vow. Now, that could be argued that, well, the scribes just simply didn't put it in there, or the authors of the text just simply didn't feel it was important to say. That's an argument that's not worth having in this discourse. So, but again, now that leads to a point that I previously made, that what Abraham did and what Jacob now suggests becomes the biblical foundation or blueprint for the tithing system. And now it becomes enacted in the Mosaic law. It becomes a requirement. And so the question begs to be asked: to whom is required to tithe? So under the Mosaic law, it is the children of Israel, but not just any individual. And again, one would have to dig into the text. And so, to give you the condensed version, we see that the primary intent of the tithe, as it has now been delineated in the Mosaic law, was a requirement placed upon the children of Israel, and it had multiple purposes. So I want to first talk a little bit about the first purpose of the requirement of the people to tithe and who was required to tithe. So the Levitical priesthood was now becoming established. And because the Levitical priesthood, or those who were Levites, they did not inherit land or cattle. So, because their commitment and their separation from the clan was specific for the tabernacle, which would then later on in history become the temple, that was their function. So they were not given land. They were not given houses. They were not given cattle. So they were not owners of anything. But yet they had a function in Israel. And that function suggested that they somehow must be supported. And so under the Mosaic law, this is where now the tithe becomes the means of economical and financial support for the Levites who will serve in the tabernacle and later in the temple as priests and workers. This was their income. Now, secondly, the tithe was intended to support the religious and the societal programs of Israel. Let me repeat that. The tithe was intended to also support the religious and societal programs of Israel. Now, what does that encompass? That encompasses the service of the tabernacle, and later down the biblical historical line, the temple, the upkeep of the tabernacle, the workers within the tabernacle, the artifices within the tabernacle, and then the temple. This is where the tithe provided for those means. Secondly, it was also intended to provide sustenance for the poor as well as foreigners. Now, who were the poor? Of course, in first and foremost, those of Israel who did not have an inheritance, who were poor and did not have resources, and then all within the region that would be counted as foreigners to Israel, meaning they were not of the bloodline, but yet they were in the region. And so the tithe served as a social welfare program for those who were less fortunate, if I can use today's common terminologies. And then third, the tithe was for the financing of the three major religious festivals that would occur each year. So these were the intents and purposes of the tithe under the Mosaic law, which at that time was a requirement. Now, the question is, so then who had to tithe? Well, those who were given land, those who were given homes, those who were given animals. So if you were a landowner, agriculture, if you were an animal owner, cattle rearing, if you were a homeowner, an inheritance, you had the requirement to tithe, right? Now, so we talk about three major festivals that it financed. One being the Passover, second being Pentecost, and then third being the Feast of tabernacles. This is how the funds were accumulated, or the resources were accumulated for the purpose of those three major feasts. And there's more instructions that goes to the supporting of those three major feasts. Now, when we talk about the support of the poor and foreigners, the law, we're talking about the Mosaic law, required a separate third year tithe. That means every third year there was an additional tithe that had to be submitted to the priests, the Levitical priests, in order to take care or support those who were considered foreigners, who were widows, and who were fatherless. All right, Michael, what are you getting at? So don't want to jump the gun, but I do want to highlight that up until this very moment of giving you an outlay of how tithing came into existence and for what purpose, readily we see the tithe is for the people, not just the Levitical priesthood, and it is for three specific festivals. We see that in the biblical text. Now, you had in the biblical text, if you continue to follow the storyline, going into the book of Deuteronomy, you see where there were some Israelites by bloodline who were too poor to tithe. And so there was then an exemption extended to such persons who were too poor to tithe. Now, these were folks of the bloodline of the children of Israel who did not have a source of income. And primarily, these were your widows whose husbands were the primary source of sustenance, who had passed on. And then you have the foreigners who could not gain a income, and so did not have land possessions, did not have home possessions, and they did not have any form of agriculture to sustain themselves. These are the poor. So they had no land. But however, now the tithing system then afforded them a societal welfare program where they could be supported from the third year tithe. And so they become now the recipients of the tithe in addition to this third year tithe. Now, here's something that is interesting, because as a homeowner, as a landowner, as a cattle herder, you were required to tithe. But every seventh year, according to the biblical text, every seventh year, which is referred to as the sabbatical year, no one would tithe. Not one person would tithe every seventh year. Why? Well, primarily because you couldn't harvest your land, number one. And so it was an opportunity to give the land a rest. And so there was no requirement to tithe every seventh year. Now, that brings me to another interesting point in the biblical text that surfaces. And that is, there was an instance in the biblical text history where it became too challenging for Israelites to travel back to Jerusalem to give their tithe, which was the central location. Today we would call that the mother church, or the head of the church organization, where we would now digitally submit these things. And so because they could not make the journey, the Mosaic law allowed for them to convert their tithe into money where they were, and one of two things could happen. They could use that money now to travel to Jerusalem, because they didn't have to bring their cattle now. They didn't have to haul their grain now, because that's expensive. And it is very daunting, depending on how far from Jerusalem they were, which is why this exemption or this allowance was made for them. So now they can convert those things to money, to a form of money in that time, and travel to Jerusalem with that money. And once they get there, now here's the interesting thing. Once they arrive in Jerusalem with the money that they've received from converting their tithe, notice their tithe was not money, it was land, animal, and food. Now that they've converted it to money and they arrive to Jerusalem, here is what the Mosaic law instructs that they can now do. Once in Jerusalem, in order to participate in one of these festivals, they would then buy their food and drink and enjoy the festival with all other tithe givers. Interesting. So we see where allowance is made for those who could not make the journey with their tithe to convert it to money, and then once in Jerusalem, buy food and drink and enjoy the festivities. So, very interesting. The second caveat to that is that, again, for those who were too poor to tithe and could not still make the journey, an allowance is made for them. And so in the Mosaic law, again in Deuteronomy, you see where God allows for such persons or individuals to convert their money, their tithe to money, and they would go to the local market and buy food, and then they would come back. They would arrange a feast in honor of the big feast, and they had to invite the Levitical priest. So long as they did this in that order, they were able to participate in the festivities, and it was considered still honorable to God because they invited the Levitical priest. And so they also get to enjoy what would be called the tithe. Now that's very interesting to note. So it leads to a question: who then benefited from the tithe? And Michael, what does that have to do with what you mentioned at the beginning about today's dilemma that we find ourselves in, where many across the globe may not be receiving SNAP benefits come November 1 from our government? I'm getting to that. So, who benefited from the tithe? Quite simply put, without going into another dissertation, the people and the Levites. I'll repeat. Those who benefited from the tithe were the people and the Levites. And so the tithe addressed three particular structures in their society. The first part, it provided an income for those who were of the Levitical bloodline, whose commitment it was to the tabernacle and then later the temple. It became their source of income for sustenance to be able to sustain themselves while carrying out their religious obligation. Second structure that it addressed is it funded the three national festivities: the Passover, the Feast of Tabernacles, and also Pentecost. It funded those three major festivals. And third, it established a system of social welfare for the poor. Now I want to get to my conclusive point and connect all of what I said to where we are today as a society, as a nation, as a people. Understanding these three structural intents of the tithe under Mosaic law, to which many will today argue that the tithe is necessary, and for many of the reasons that I pointed out here, but in just different modern day terminology. I want to focus in on the third structural intent, the establishing of a system of social welfare for the poor. And the poor included those without or with minimal income to support themselves, those who were truly widows with children or without children, and those who were foreigners or aliens to the land who could not get gainful employment to sustain themselves. Here is the point that I want to make. I do believe, and I am confident, that as a whole, the church organization is failing in its mission. I don't mean that offensively. It is not an attack against any particular church leader. It is not an attack against any church goer. It is not an attack against any Bible believing child of God. It is a factual reality that as a whole, though there are many denominations within Christendom, as a whole, the church, which is not the buildings individually, but the people that are incorporated into the system of belief that they say is Christianity. The church as a whole is failing in its mission. I know that is a very bold statement, and I'm going to get some backlash from many that will watch this video, that will respond to this video, and that is perfectly fine, because I am not here to make a controversial argument, though it can be very controversial for those looking and hearing. I understand that. The reality is, as a whole, the church organization today is failing in its mission. Now, Michael, what do you mean? The church receives tithes. The church pays its bills. Some have paid off the mortgage and burned it. Some have set up a food pantry at their particular location for those within their area. So what do you mean the church is failing its mission? I will repeat. As a whole, the church organization is failing in its mission. It has never been, from the first inception of the concept of tithing, the responsibility of any local government non-affiliated with the family of God to take on this responsibility according to the biblical text. It has been the mission given to those who say they are the children of God to take on this mission of providing, amongst the other two supports, a system of support for those who are poor, those who are widows, those who are foreigners. So how do we fix this? It's really simple. It really is. It is not rocket science. And I've said this for more than 40 years. First, as a new born-again believer, when I first came into the Christian faith, then as a minister learning and growing and developing in my faith, then as a recognized evangelist, going throughout certain cities and states, preaching and teaching, then as an ordained elder and pastor of a local church, I have been saying this from day one. It is the responsibility of the church organization or church institution to take care of the people, not just the leaders and workers within a church building. It is the church's responsibility as an organization overall to have in place an established social welfare system to look after the needs of people. Now, it is very disheartening for a devoted and dedicated member of any local church institution to have given of their resources painlessly while trying to survive, and then to be faced with when they do not have the means by which to continue surviving, to turn to their church institution and say, I need help. And the response is, we'll pray for you. That is very disheartening. And people are leaving the church institution not solely because they are mad at something said or done, but because they feel slighted. I want that to sink in. They feel slighted by their particular church. Why? Because as an organization overall, the church is failing in its mission. The church as an organization wholly does not have a centrally established system of support for the people. And so they've been directing and redirecting the people to governmental systems that are at the mercies of government leaders who can change their minds in a whim. Now, I know I've said some rather piercing remarks in this. I'm aware of that. And I have been intentional about choosing my words carefully. And if I have offended anyone, please understand that was not the intent. But I did want to point out a reality. And it is evident now that we are faced with this government shutdown and folks not getting paid for the work that they have already done, and those who are still poor and cannot fend for themselves and will not receive certain governmental benefits as a result of the government shutdown and the long-standing ripple effect that it now will have. And yet the church as a whole, their message is, we must pray. That's a bit disheartening to the person who, after having prayed on bended knees, get up, go to the refrigerator, go to their cupboards. It is still bare. Go to their individual church, and there's not enough, or there's nothing at all to give to them to sustain them. But the response again is keep praying. I'm going to stop right there. Hopefully in the next day or two, or however, when I get a time again from my hectic schedule, I want to do a follow-up video, and I want to talk a little bit more about the tithing system under modern Christianity. I hope that I've not offended anyone, but I understand that it is part of the human experience that we will offend one another. So I want to apologize again up front if I've offended any, not the intent. I hope that you would consider what I've shared and that you would look further into the points made, and that you would do a deep dive in the biblical text and go beyond the surface of what is promulgated across the pulpit, and that there would be a true conviction of heart, because it must start with at least one. Thank you so much for allowing me, if you stayed through this whole live, or if you've watched this whole video, thank you for your time and your patience in my indulgence of conveying this message. I appreciate you, and I wish all well during these very, very trying times. Until we meet again, be blessed. Ma'at Hotep.